Hey guys, and welcome back to another evening of deeply comfortable paranoia. I'm your host, and tonight we're diving into something more unsettling than finding a mysterious stain on your kitchen counter that you absolutely cannot identify. We're talking about a cold case so strange that even the people who lived through it decided it was better to forget it entirely. Before we settle into this story, do me a favor. Actually, don't do me a favor. Just consider doing this. Grab whatever blanket is closest to you. Get comfortable. If you have a fan, turn it on. Seriously, I don't make the rules about ambient noise and sleep quality. I just respect them. And if you're enjoying this journey into the inexplicable, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. The algorithm loves geography, and I love knowing I'm narrating into the void of people in actual physical locations. Now, while you're settling in, let me ask you some questions. What did people do before security cameras? How did they investigate anything? They just believed witnesses? They just took notes in little books and hoped nobody was lying? Genuinely absurd when you think about it. And speaking of cameras, how many cameras are watching you right now without you knowing it? Your phone, your laptop, maybe that printer at work that's been acting a little too smart for a printer. The average person in 1972 had no idea they were being filmed. The average person in 2025 has no idea they're being filmed. The difference is, in 1972, when people disappeared, there was no footage to prove where they went. Tonight, we're talking about 6 nurses in 1972. Margaret, Ruth, Dorothy, Helen, Susan, and Claire. They worked at St. Catherine's Regional Hospital in a town most of you have never heard of. In a state you could probably locate on a map if someone gave you a solid 30 seconds and maybe a hint. These 6 women clocked in on a Thursday night in October. They did their jobs. They walked into the basement to retrieve supplies. And then something happened that was so impossible, so fundamentally reality-bending, that the people in charge decided the best solution was to make it disappear. Which is a funny strategy, by the way. People are asking questions about the missing nurses. Better make all the evidence vanish and hope everyone's memory is as bad as mine. Congratulations. You just woken up in the middle of a cold case that refuses to stay cold at ST. Catherine's Regional Hospital sits on a quiet street in a town where everyone's related to someone, where gossip travels at the speed of telephone wires, and where mysterious events are treated like mild weather, unfortunate, but ultimately manageable. The hospital itself was built in 1958. Modern, clean, equipped with the kind of technology that made people feel safe, even though that safety was mostly an illusion. But here's what nobody mentioned. The hospital was built on the site of something older. In 1903, a psychiatric ward occupied the same plot of land. St. Augustine's Asylum. They called it. 13 years of operation. Then a fire in 1916. Not a big fire. Nobody died. But it was enough to cause problems. Enough to cause structural damage. Enough to cause decisions that would be carefully buried in municipal records for the next 60 years. When they built St. Catherine's Regional Hospital in 1958, they didn't demolish the old structure completely. They built on top of it, over it, around it, which sounds like a small architectural detail. But it wasn't. October 14th, 1972, a Thursday. The kind of night where the weather is at perfect autumn cold, not threatening, just honest, just letting you know that summer is absolutely gone and you're going to be dealing with darkness for the next 6 months. The kind of night that makes people stay indoors. The kind of night when a hospital's night shift feels less like employment and more like a deliberate choice to exist in the last place on earth where anything strange might happen. Margaret arrived first, as she always did. She was a senior nurse. 42 years old, had been working at St. Catherine's since it opened. She knew the building like it was an extension of her own body. Every hallway, every shortcut, every place where the lights flickered just a little too enthusiastically. Ruth and Dorothy arrived together. They always did, carpooling from a neighborhood on the east side. Helen came alone, as always, reading the same book she'd been reading for the last 4 months, and genuinely seemed okay with that arrangement. Susan was new, only 6 months into the job. Still had the kind of energy that made her dangerous in her own right, too willing to work extra hours. Too willing to push for efficiency. Too willing to not ask questions when things didn't add up. And Claire was a quiet one. The six of them clocked in at 10:47 p.m., ready for another night of chart updates, vital sign checks, and the kind of conversations that only happen when everyone's tired and the world feels smaller than it actually is. They settled into the rhythms that night shift workers understand instinctively. The slow periods, the sudden surges. The way time moves differently when you're working while other people sleep. The way your body starts to understand that you're not living in the same reality as everyone else. Around 11:45 p.m., Margaret made a decision. The supply room was running low on bandages, sutures, some medications that needed rotation. These items weren't on the 4th floor or the 3rd floor or any of the convenient locations. These items were in the basement, storage room B, 2 floors down, which was fine, totally normal. Supply runs were routine, except nobody really liked to go to the basement, if you want to know the truth. But that's the thing about hospital work. You do the things that need to be done. You don't ask if there's a better way. You just go. At 11:47 p.m., all 6 of them headed toward the basement stairs. They brought a cart. They brought good attitudes. They brought absolutely no idea that they were stepping into the exact moment that would consume the next 50 years of investigation, speculation, and institutional denial. Before we talk about what actually happened, we need to understand what should have happened. Hospital night shifts are incredibly consistent, not because anyone particularly wants them to be, but because consistency is how you survive working while the sun is gone. You develop rhythms. You follow patterns. You do things the same way every night, so that your brain doesn't have to work quite as hard at understanding what's happening around you. Margaret's routine was legendary. She'd been doing this job long enough that she had a system, a carefully calibrated approach to the night shift that had kept her sane for 14 years. Every 2 hours, she'd walk the floors, check on patients, update charts. Around 1 a.m., she'd make coffee in the break room. Terrible coffee, the kind of coffee that tastes like it was brewed from regret and water from the bottom of the hospital's emergency supplies. Around 3 a.m., when people were at their lowest point, when the entire human body conspires to make you want to sleep forever, she'd do rounds again. Then home by 7 a.m. Same schedule, every night, for 14 years. Ruth had a routine too. She'd spend her nights in the maternity ward, monitoring the 3 or 4 patients who were usually there. She'd read magazines that were older than some of the staff. She'd do the actual work when people called for her. The rest of the time, she'd exist in that particular state of alertness that can only come from knowing that at any moment, someone might scream, and you'd have to be ready. Dorothy was a medication specialist. Everything pharmaceutical happened through her. Her routine was precise, almost obsessive. She had notebooks full of careful handwriting, documenting every dose, every time, every patient. The kind of work that would seem boring if you didn't understand that it was literally the only thing standing between order and catastrophe in a hospital setting. Helen worked in pediatrics. She spent her nights with the children, the sick children, the children whose parents had gone home and would return tomorrow to find either a child getting better or a child who would need to be discussed with careful language by people in white coats. Helen's routine was less about systems and more about presence. She was there. She was attentive. She was the kind of person who actually cared in a way that made the entire job make sense. Susan was still learning the routine. She was training, essentially, still being shown where things were, still developing the instinctive knowledge that comes from doing something the same way for months and months. She was probably nervous about the basement. It was the kind of assignment that gets given to newer staff as a test. Can you go to the basement and come back up without having an existential crisis? And Claire's routine was personal. She had a way of moving through the hospital that seemed almost invisible. She'd appear where she was needed. She'd do her work. She'd disappear again. Nobody really knew much about her outside of work. She was polite, professional, and she volunteered for basement runs more often than seemed entirely reasonable. Now, here's where the routine was supposed to continue. Margaret would lead the group downstairs. It would take maybe 4 minutes to get to the basement storage room B. Another 6 or 7 minutes to load the cart with supplies. Another 4 minutes to return. 15 minutes maximum. They should have been back by midnight. At 11:47 p.m., the 6 of them went downstairs. At 11:49 p.m., according to the actual clock on the hospital's second floor, they came back upstairs. 2 minutes. That's what the hospital's logbook said. That's what witnesses reported seeing. 2 minutes for 6 people to go to the basement, load a cart with supplies, and return. Except nobody could remember exactly how long they were gone. That's the detail that people always miss. Nobody actually watched the clock. Nobody checked their watch. One moment, Margaret was walking toward the stairwell, and the next moment, they were coming back. It wasn't impossible. It was just impossible in a way that made everyone's brain refuse to process what had actually happened. Time was weird. Time was flexible. Time was something that couldn't be trusted in that particular hallway on that particular night. It wasn't until later, much later, when someone actually checked the security footage, that anyone realized how much time had actually passed in that basement. 3 hours and 17 minutes. Here's a fact about 1972. Security cameras were not common in hospitals. They were expensive. They were unreliable. And they required someone to actually maintain the equipment, which meant someone had to understand technology that was cutting edge and temperamental and prone to just randomly stopping in the middle of recording something important. St. Catherine's Regional Hospital had 3 security cameras, one in the main entrance, one in the pharmacy, because hospitals kept drugs, and drugs meant theft was always a concern, and one in the basement, supposedly. The basement camera was always listed in the hospital security documentation as maintenance camera for structural monitoring, which is a very official way of saying a camera that definitely exists, but nobody talks about. It did exist. It had been installed in 1965 by a contractor who was never asked to come back. It was mounted inside a maintenance panel that looked exactly like all the other maintenance panels. It recorded onto 16mm film that was automatically rewound and replaced every 36 hours. It had a timer that documented exact timestamps on the actual film itself. And it was running on October 14, 1972. Detective Frank Morrison found the camera by accident. He came to the hospital 3 days after the nurses disappeared, ready to conduct interviews and do the standard investigative work. He was interviewing the maintenance staff, asking them about the basement, asking them what kind of access people would have, asking them innocent questions that were designed to build a timeline and establish facts. And one of the maintenance workers said something that made Morrison pause. He said, "There's a camera down there, in the basement, just so you know." Morrison asked why he hadn't mentioned it earlier. The maintenance worker shrugged. He said he'd forgotten about it. It wasn't his camera. He didn't maintain it. He just knew it existed, in that way that people who work in buildings know about things that don't directly affect their job. You understand they're there, but you've trained yourself not to think about them. It took Morrison 2 hours to locate the actual camera. 2 hours of searching through that basement, understanding the layout, understanding the way light moved through that space, understanding how isolated it actually was from the main hospital. When he found it, the camera was still running. The film reel was 3/4 through its cycle and stored in a locked maintenance cabinet, a cabinet that required a key that only 3 people had. Were 9 reels of previous footage. 9 reels. That meant the camera had been running continuously for 324 hours. Nearly 2 weeks of footage. All of it available. All of it preserved on actual film, which meant it couldn't be deleted. It couldn't be corrupted by magnetic fields. It couldn't be blamed on technology failure. It was documentary evidence, permanent and absolute. Morrison pulled the footage from the night of October 14th. What he saw made him sit down in the basement of that hospital for 45 minutes without moving. The film was grainy. This was 1972. Remember, surveillance photography was not high definition. It was black and white. It was a kind of image that looked like it was filmed underwater, with everything slightly blurred and slightly wrong. But it was clear enough, absolutely clear enough. Clear enough that Morrison could identify each nurse. Clear enough that Morrison could see exactly what happened during that basement run. At 11:47 p.m., Margaret and the 6 nurses entered the basement storage area. At 11:49 p.m., they hadn't left yet. They were still there. For 6 more minutes, they stood in the storage room, doing nothing, just standing, and Morrison couldn't see why. Then they moved, and Morrison watched as they walked toward something, toward a wall, toward a section of the basement that shouldn't have had anything behind it, and they disappeared. Literally. One moment they were there. The next moment, they were gone, off camera, behind something, in a place where the camera couldn't follow. At 12:04 a.m., they reappeared, different somehow, clothes rumpled, hair messed up, moving slower, like they were tired, which made sense, except they'd only been gone from the storage room for maybe 10 minutes according to the clock. Then they walked back toward the camera, and at 12:06 a.m., they left the basement area, walking toward the stairs that would take them back to the second floor. The clock on the film said 12:06 a.m., but the clock on the second floor had logged their return at 11:49 p.m. Nobody knew how to reconcile those two things. Morrison watched the film again, and again, and again. The time stamps on the basement footage were clear. The film advance was consistent. The clock in the frame was visible and readable. They had definitely been in that basement for at least 17 minutes, probably more. The time stamps didn't lie. But also, witnesses, actual, sober, professional hospital workers, had seen them come back upstairs at 11:49 p.m., 2 minutes after they left. There was no explanation, just contradiction, just evidence that couldn't be reconciled, just the beginning of something that would consume Frank Morrison's entire career. When you watch security footage over and over again, looking for something you don't understand, your brain starts to do weird things. It creates meaning where there might be none. It sees patterns in static. It convinces itself that something impossible might actually make sense if you just understand the right framework. Detective Morrison spent 17 days watching that footage. 17 days. He watched in the basement. He watched it at home. He probably dreamed about it. And with each viewing, he noticed new things. Small details. Impossible details. The section of wall where the nurses had gone was marked on the film. Morrison could see it clearly. It was the western wall of the basement storage room, behind where the old medical files were kept. On film, as the nurses approached, there was definitely something there. A slight discoloration of the concrete, a suggestion of something beneath the surface, an indication that the wall wasn't quite as solid as it appeared. And then, more strangely, when Morrison actually went to that spot in the basement and examined it, he felt nothing. No seams, no edges, no indication that there was anything behind that wall at all. The wall was solid, complete, like it had never been anything else. The only way to know something would be to look at the footage. The hospital's blueprints were brought in. The original plans from 1958. The plans showed the basement layout, the storage rooms, the utility tunnels. But there was no indication of any sealed passage. No mark indicating that the western wall had any significance. So Morrison requested older blueprints. The original structural designs from a 1903 asylum. And suddenly, everything changed. The 1903 asylum had indeed had a basement, a deep basement, multiple levels, actually, and one of the tunnels, one specific tunnel that ran east-west of the property, connected the main building to what the blueprints called the isolation ward, a place for the most severe cases, a place that had been boarded up after the 1916 fire. When they built the hospital in 1958, they had sealed that tunnel, or so they thought. They had poured concrete. They had reinforced walls. They had attempted to make it so completely inaccessible that anyone examining the building would assume it had never existed. But concrete degrades, especially old concrete, especially concrete exposed to water damage and soil pressure for 60 years. Morrison had a structural engineer examine the western wall of the basement storage room. The engineer's report was careful, professional, and absolutely damning. The wall was hollow. Behind the concrete veneer, there was definitely a void space, definitely an opening, definitely a tunnel. Someone had disguised it extremely well. Someone had maintained that disguise for years. Someone had made sure that nothing about the hospital's official floor plans or official understanding of its own basement acknowledged that this space existed. But the security camera had captured the nurses approaching it with the certainty of people who'd been told exactly where to go, with the sureness of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. The footage showed Margaret reaching toward a point in the wall, not touching it, just reaching. And then a section of concrete shifted, moved, slid aside like a door in a way that Morrison could see on film, but couldn't replicate when he tried to find the mechanism himself. And then the nurses walked through, and the wall closed behind them. Approximately 17 minutes passed. Then the wall opened again. The nurses emerged. They moved through the storage room exactly as if nothing had happened. No confusion, no alarm, no hesitation, just routine, just the resumption of a normal basement run. And the wall sealed behind them. Morrison went to the hospital's administration. He brought the blueprints. He brought the footage. He brought the structural engineer's report. He brought evidence that was impossible to deny. And the hospital's administration, in a move that would define the next 50 years of this case, requested an immediate meeting with the hospital's board of directors. Morrison was not invited to that meeting. Before we talk about what happened next, we need to understand something about institutions. Institutions don't like mysteries. Institutions don't like uncertainty. Institutions absolutely do not appreciate it when a murder detective shows up with evidence that something impossible is happening in their basement. Institutions prefer to manage problems quietly, to settle them, to make them go away. St. Catherine's Regional Hospital had been operating since 1958. 14 years of good reputation. 14 years of being a safe place where people want to get better. 14 years of community trusting this institution with their health, their births, their deaths, their most vulnerable moments. And then, in the span of a few weeks, the institution's own building became a mystery. Its own basement became a question. The hospital's board of directors met on October 21st, 1972, 7 days after the nurses disappeared. The meeting lasted 6 hours. In attendance, the hospital administrator, the chief surgeon, the head of nursing, 3 board members, and a lawyer. A lawyer. That's the part that tells you everything about how seriously they understood the situation. When the meeting ended, the hospital issued a statement. It said in careful legal language that 6 nurses had voluntarily left their employment on October 14th due to personal circumstances. It said the hospital had received resignation letters from each of them. It said that the hospital would continue to operate with normal staffing levels. It said that rumors about missing persons or suspicious disappearances were unfounded and not reflective of what had actually occurred. There were no resignation letters. Nobody had ever seen resignation letters. But the statement had been made. The hospital had said its narrative. 4 days later, Detective Morrison received a letter, typed on hospital letterhead. It informed him that the hospital was claiming jurisdiction over the investigation, that the nurses were hospital employees, that what had occurred was an employment matter, not a criminal matter, that the hospital would be handling any further inquiry itself, that Detective Morrison's assistance was no longer required. Morrison had no legal standing to argue. The hospital was technically correct. If the women had quit, then they hadn't disappeared. If they hadn't disappeared, then there was no crime. If there was no crime, then there was no investigation. But Morrison had the footage. Morrison had the proof. He went to the police department. He went to his superiors. He told them about the sealed tunnel. He showed them the blueprints. He showed them the footage. And his superiors, being careful people who understood how institutions work, made a decision. They sealed his file, not because they didn't believe him, because they understood that there was nothing they could prove. The hospital had claimed the nurses had quit. The hospital had sealed the basement. The hospital had made the whole thing official and institutional, and therefore beyond the reach of a single detective with a bad theory. But here's what nobody counted on. The hospital's secret wasn't just underground. The hospital's secret went back decades. It went back to 1903. It went back to an asylum where people had been kept, where people had been treated, where people had been forgotten. And if you were to believe what happened on the film, If you were to believe what the nurses had actually done, then the hospital's secret wasn't just about a sealed tunnel. It was about what was on the other side of that sealed tunnel. It was about what exactly existed in the space between 1903 and 1972. It was about what the institution had so carefully hidden that even the building's own blueprints refused to acknowledge it. The hospital understood this. That's why the meeting lasted 6 hours. That's why a lawyer was involved. That's why everything moved so fast from investigation to silence. Because if the nurses had found what was in that tunnel, if they had seen what had been left there, if they understood what the hospital had been hiding for 14 years, then the institution itself was at risk. Frank Morrison was 34 years old when he became obsessed with the St. Catherine's case. He was a good detective, competent, methodical, the kind of person who solved cases because he was patient and careful, not because he was brilliant or intuitive. He had a wife, a daughter, a mortgage, a reasonable life that made sense and followed normal patterns. Then he watched the footage, and the reasonable part of his life started to deteriorate. It began with small things. He'd stay late at work reviewing the file, even though officially there was no file. He'd request documents from the hospital under the pretense of other investigations. He'd drive by the hospital at odd hours, just looking at the building. He'd talk to people who had worked at the hospital, asking them careful questions about the basement, about the old asylum, about what they'd heard or seen or suspected. People noticed. They didn't understand it, but they noticed. Morrison's wife noticed. She noticed that he'd come home late, that he'd be quiet, that he'd sit in the garage sometimes for hours, not doing anything, just sitting. His superiors noticed too. They made a decision to redirect his attention. They gave him other cases, high-profile cases, cases that would keep him busy and away from the hospital situation. Morrison did the work. He solved the cases. But every moment not spent on an active investigation was spent on the hospital. He developed a complete timeline. He documented every inconsistency between the hospital's official story and what the footage showed. He created maps of the basement, overlaid in 1903 asylum blueprints with the current hospital floor plans, trying to figure out where that tunnel actually went. He interviewed every person who had ever worked at the hospital, searching for someone who might have an explanation. And people talked to him, not officially, but informally. A maintenance worker would mention the sounds he'd heard from behind the sealed walls. An orderly would talk about the cold spot that was always in the western basement. A retired nurse from the original staff would mention, carefully and quietly, that there had been talk about something in the basement. Nothing specific, but talk. Morrison compiled it. All of it. Everything. He created a file that was 3 inches thick with documents, photographs, interview notes, and speculations. He had a corkboard in his garage with string connecting different pieces of information, trying to construct a narrative from evidence that didn't add up. And then, in December 1972, 2 months after the nurses disappeared, Morrison did something that would get him removed from the police force. He went to the hospital basement, alone, without permission, without authorization, and he tried to find a mechanism that operated the door. He spent 4 hours in that basement, for hours searching the western wall, looking for a latch, a pressure point, a release. He used tools. He struck the concrete. He tried to move sections of the wall by force. He found nothing. No mechanism. No way to access whatever was on the other side. But he did notice something. There was a smell. A faint smell, barely perceptible, coming from somewhere behind the wall. A smell like something old, something stored, something that had been sealed away for a very long time. The hospital security found him there at 2 a.m. They brought him out. They called the police. They filed a report accusing him of trespassing and property damage. And the police, understanding that Morrison was compromised by obsession, removed him from the case entirely. Gave him a choice, seek counseling or resign. Morrison resigned. He was 36 years old. He had 14 years of service, 14 years of a career he'd built, and was gone in an afternoon because he'd broken the rules trying to understand something that nobody wanted him to understand. He didn't work another police case after that. He took odd jobs, security work, private investigation. He maintained his file on St. Catherine's. He continued to gather information. And he became exactly the kind of person the institution had been banking on. Someone too damaged by the obsession to be credible, but too dedicated to stop looking. If you want to understand what actually happened at St. Catherine's, you have to talk to the people who were there before the official silence. The people who worked during the hospital's earliest years, before the basement became forbidden territory, before the sealed wall became an accepted part of the building, before everyone learned not to ask questions. There was a maintenance worker named Douglas. He'd been at the hospital since 1960. He remembered when the administration first became concerned about the basement. He remembered the reinforcement projects, the sealed wall, the careful documentation of what was being sealed and why. He never saw what was behind the wall, but he heard conversations. He heard the administrators talking in careful voices about what needed to be secured. Douglas retired in 1968. He spent the rest of his life in the town where St. Catherine stood, and he never, ever went back to the hospital, not even when he was old, not even when he might have needed medical care. He just stayed away. When asked why, he'd change the subject. When pressed, he'd say something vague about remembering how to take care of himself. There was an orderly named Patricia. She'd worked in the hospital from 1958 to 1971. She'd covered the graveyard shift sometimes. She'd gone into the basement regularly, but only to the areas that were designated for regular use. She'd never gone toward the western wall. Nobody went there. It was one of those unspoken rules that develops in institutions, a place that everyone understands is off limits without anyone explicitly stating it. But she'd heard things. Late at night, when she was coming back from delivering materials, a sound like wind moving through a tunnel, like air being displaced, like something was still circulating in the space behind the wall, even though the wall had supposedly been sealed for years. Patricia would tell people about this, carefully, not in a way that suggested she believed something was wrong, just in a factual way. She'd heard sounds. That's all. She was just reporting what she'd heard. It was how you talked about the basement, if you wanted to avoid making people uncomfortable. You reported facts without implications. There was a security guard. His name was lost to history, because he died in 1979 and nobody wrote down his detailed experiences. But the oral history suggests that he'd seen something, that sometime around 1970, he'd noticed a basement camera, and he'd been the one who realized there was actually footage being recorded, and instead of reporting it officially, he'd just mentioned it casually to a maintenance worker, as if it were common knowledge, because that's how secrets work in institutions. Nobody says anything directly. Everyone just knows. And the knowing is enough to keep the secret safe. The nurses who disappeared had known, presumably. They'd known where to go in the basement. They'd known that there was something behind the wall. They'd gone to that wall, as if they'd been briefed on its exact location. And they'd gone in, apparently on purpose. Or so the footage suggested. But what the footage couldn't show was whether they'd gone willingly or under some form of duress. Whether they'd understood what they were walking into. Whether they'd had any choice in the matter at all. Morrison spent months trying to find someone who could explain this. Someone who could answer the most fundamental question. How did 6 modern, professional nurses know about a sealed tunnel that the hospital administration was desperately trying to hide? The answer, when it came, arrived not from a hospital employee, but from Claire's sister. 2 years. 2 full years passed. Morrison had settled into his new life as a man marked by obsession, forced into security work and private investigation, maintained his file in his garage, slowly accumulating more information about the hospital while the institution itself moved on. The hospital hired new night shift nurses. They trained them. They worked their shifts. Nobody disappeared. The institution stabilized. The crisis, for all practical purposes, was over. Morrison had stopped expecting answers. He'd learned to live with the contradiction. The film footage in the hospital's official story couldn't both be true, but he had no power to reconcile them. He'd become the kind of person that institutions are actually quite comfortable with. Someone who knows something is wrong, but has been so thoroughly delegitimized that nobody has to listen to him anymore. And then, on a Tuesday in February of 1974, a manila envelope arrived at the police station. It was addressed to Detective Frank Morrison. His name was written in careful, precise handwriting. No return address. No postal markings that indicated where it had come from. Just dropped off. Left at the front desk. Anonymous. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, and a strip of 16mm film. The letter contained one sentence. Exactly one. And it said, "They didn't disappear. They're still trying to leave." The film was dated February 10th, 1974, 3 days before the letter arrived. It was footage from the hospital basement, recent footage, and it showed something that Morrison's hands began to shake as he watched it. It showed movement behind the sealed wall. Not clearly. The angle was wrong. But there was definitely something. A shadow. A suggestion of movement. Something that indicated the space behind the wall was not empty. Something was there. Something was active. But more than that, the film showed something else. The camera angle was different from a 1972 footage. This camera was installed somewhere else, which meant the hospital had not removed the security equipment, which meant the hospital was still monitoring the basement, which meant someone had deliberately captured this new footage and sent it to Morrison. Someone inside the hospital was reaching out. Morrison tried to trace the letter. He brought it to a handwriting expert. The expert said it was careful, deliberate, the work of someone who was trying to disguise their natural handwriting. A woman, probably, someone with education, someone with access to a typewriter, and someone who understood that they were breaking a very important rule by sending this message. He ran the film through the same analysis he'd done with the original footage. The timestamp was legitimate. The film advance was consistent. The quality matched the hospital's camera equipment. This was real. This was contemporary. This was evidence that whatever was happening at St. Catherine's, it had not stopped. It had continued. For 2 full years, behind a sealed wall, something had continued. But here's where it gets worse. Morrison reported the letter and film to his superiors. He showed them the evidence. He explained that this proved the original investigation had been incomplete, that the hospital was hiding something active, not just historical, that they needed to reopen the case. And his superiors made a phone call to the hospital, and the hospital denied everything. The hospital said it had no record of any new security cameras. The hospital said it had no explanation for film. The hospital suggested carefully that Detective Morrison might be fabricating evidence to support his obsession. And because Morrison had already been marked as obsessed, because he'd already been removed from the police force, because he'd already become a liability rather than an asset, nobody believed him. The letter and film vanished from a police evidence room. Morrison has no idea what happened to them. They were just gone, checked out, filed away, or destroyed. Nobody could quite remember. It was the kind of thing that happens when institutions decide something needs to disappear. But Morrison kept copies. He'd learned that lesson. He'd photographed the letter. He'd made duplicates of film. And he kept those copies in his file, in his garage. A physical testament to the fact that someone, somewhere inside that hospital, had been trying to tell him something. The institutional death of an investigation is a quiet thing. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, through decisions and non-decisions, through the gradual movement of power away from people who care and toward people who would prefer the problem simply go away. By 1975, St. Catherine's Regional Hospital had moved forward. The hospital underwent renovations. Structural renovations. They called it. The basement was sealed. Not just the wall. The entire basement access was restricted. New stairs were installed on the 3rd floor, bypassing the lower levels entirely. All basement functions were moved to the sublevel of an adjacent building. The space where the 6 nurses had disappeared was, quite literally, removed from the hospital's operational geography. And then the hospital's board of directors settled with the families. Not publicly. Quietly. Through lawyers and careful language. They reached out to Margaret's family, to Ruth's family, to Dorothy's, Helen, Susan's, and Claire's families. And they offered them a choice. Either accept a settlement and sign a non-disclosure agreement or pursue litigation against a major hospital, spend years in court, and very possibly lose. The families, being practical people, accepted the settlement. The amounts were substantial. The agreements were ironclad. Nobody would ever speak publicly about what had happened to their daughters, sisters, or wives. The 6 women were effectively erased from public discourse. They became names in a sealed court file. They became people who had simply ceased to exist in any way that mattered to history. Detective Morrison, now in his late 30s, tried to keep investigating, but he had no authority. He had no institutional backing. He had no evidence that hadn't been disputed or disappeared. He had only his conviction that something impossible had happened, and his increasingly desperate certainty that someone, somewhere, understood what it was. He hired a private investigator, a man named Robert Chun, who had his own issues with institutional authority and was willing to do work that institutional people wouldn't touch. Together, they tried to reconstruct what had actually happened. They interviewed former hospital employees. They tracked down the families of the disappeared nurses, and they hit wall after wall of silence. The hospital's administration, understanding that Morrison was never going to stop, made a final decision. They came to him with an offer. They told him that if he would stop pursuing the investigation, if he would agree to cease his private inquiries, they would provide him with a document, an explanation, a closure. Morrison was desperate enough to accept. The document they provided was a typed statement, 4 pages long, explaining that the 6 nurses had been involved in a psychiatric episode, that they had together experienced a shared delusion, that they had voluntarily entered a private psychiatric facility for treatment, that the hospital had covered their situation to protect their privacy and their family's dignity, that they were, in fact, alive and well, living quiet lives, and the matter could now be considered resolved. The document was unsigned. It was attributed to hospital administration. It was carefully worded to be non-actionable. There was nothing in it that could be proven false, because it made no specific claims that could be verified. It was institutional language at its finest, official enough to sound authoritative, vague enough to be meaningless. Morrison received the document, and then he did something that surprised everyone. He accepted it. He closed his file. He moved on, or at least, he appeared to move on. He got a job as a security consultant, a real job, with real pay. He bought a small house. He seemed to outside observers to have finally let go of his obsession. He still maintained the file, but privately. He still researched, but quietly. He still thought about the 6 nurses in the basement and the impossible timeline, but he kept it to himself. He lived this way for 5 years. And then in 1980, he had a heart attack, a massive one. He survived, but barely. And during his recovery, lying in a hospital bed, not St. Catherine's, carefully not St. Catherine's, he made a decision. He decided to write a book, not a tell-all, not an accusation, a book presented as a true crime investigation, a documentation of the case, the evidence, the contradictions, a narrative that would exist in the public record permanently, so that when he eventually died, which the heart attack had reminded him could happen at any time, someone would have access to the complete information. He spent the last 15 years of his life working on this book. It was never published. Publishers didn't want it. Too strange. Too unresolved. Too much like a mental health crisis, rather than a criminal investigation. But Morrison finished it. He completed the entire manuscript. He left it to a nephew with instructions that it should be preserved, archived, kept available. And in 1995, Morrison died. Heart failure. Completely unrelated to anything at the hospital. Almost certainly, but you never know. Sometimes obsession is a long, slow process of killing you from the inside. The case was officially closed in 1976. The file was sealed. The basement at St. Catherine's was restricted. The hospital continued to operate. New generations of staff came in. They didn't know about the nurses. They didn't know about the sealed tunnel. They didn't know about the impossible timeline or the mysterious footage or any of it. They just worked in a modern hospital, unaware that beneath their feet, something remained sealed away. And the institution, the hospital, the board directors, the lawyers, they won. They contained the narrative. They protected the secret. They made the problem disappear through the time-honored institutional method, acknowledging just enough to be heard, while saying absolutely nothing that could be verified or acted upon. Here's what nobody tells you about cold cases. Sometimes it's better that way. We live in a world where we expect resolution. We expect that mysteries get solved, that truth emerges, that the good guys and bad guys are eventually identified and dealt with appropriately. It's very American, very modern, very satisfying in narrative sense. But the truth about mysteries, real mysteries, the ones that matter, is that they often refuse resolution. They sit in the institutional margins for decades, neither solved nor forgotten, neither confirmed nor dismissed. St. Catherine's Regional Hospital is still operating. I'm not going to tell you which hospital or which town, because this isn't about identifying a specific location. It's about understanding the pattern. The hospital is still there. The basement is still there. The nurses' names are still documented in employment records, though their files are restricted. Their photographs still exist in old yearbooks, if you know where to look, but the security footage is gone. The sealed basement is inaccessible. The tunnel that might or might not connect to a 1903 asylum is hidden behind concrete and bureaucratic indifference. The night shift workers at that hospital, the current night shift workers in 2024 or 2025, or whenever you're listening to this, they still don't go to the basement alone. It's not a rule. It's just something they do. It's institutional memory passed down through action rather than explanation. Don't go to the basement alone. Why not? Just don't. That's how secrets survive in institutions. They become practices. They become habits. They become things that people understand without understanding them. Detective Morrison's book, the manuscript he spent 15 years writing, it exists in archives, university archives, libraries, the kind of places where obscure documents go to wait for historians who might someday care about them. You could probably find it if you tried. You could probably read his complete investigation, his documented contradictions, his careful analysis of impossible evidence. But you also might not find it, because institutions are very good at making inconvenient documents difficult to locate, not by destroying them, that's too direct, just by archiving them in ways that make them theoretically available but practically obscure, by cataloging them under unexpected subjects, by storing them in climate control rooms that require specific permissions to access. And that's the thing about this story. It sits in the space between truth and rumor, between documented fact and institutional denial. The film footage existed. The hospital confirmed there was a camera. The administration confirmed there were sealed areas. But the specific details, what was behind the wall, what happened to the nurses, how time seemed to work differently in that basement, those details remain unresolved, which is in a strange way comforting, because if the mystery were solved, if it turned out to be something mundane, an accident, a criminal act, a completely rational explanation, then it would lose something. It would become a true crime story with an ending. It would be sad, maybe horrifying, but ultimately understandable. The human mind is good at processing understood horror. It's the ununderstood horror that stays with you, the mystery that refuses closure. The 6 nurses, Margaret, Ruth, Dorothy, Helen, Susan, and Claire, they exist in that unresolved space now. They're not dead, necessarily. The hospital statement suggested they were alive. They're not exactly missing, because there's documentation that they left their employment. But they're not here either. They're in the margins of official reality, in the spaces between institutional acknowledgement and institutional denial. And the basement at St. Catherine's continues to exist. The sealed wall continues to exist. Whatever was behind it continues to exist, presumably in the dark and the cold and the absolute quiet of a space that nobody goes anymore. Sometimes the most frightening mysteries are the ones that nobody wants to solve. The ones where institutional power is exercised not to find answers, but to prevent answers from ever being found. Because if you solve a mystery, you have to deal with the consequences. You have to act on what you've learned. You have to make decisions. But if you leave a mystery unsolved, you can maintain the status quo. You can keep operating the hospital. You can keep hiring night shift nurses. You can keep the secret and the building and the institution all functioning together in a careful equilibrium that nobody wants to disturb. That's the real horror of the story, I think. Not what might be behind the wall. Not what might have happened to the nurses. but the absolute competence with which an institution managed the situation, the complete success with which an organization made a problem disappear through inaction, legal agreements, and the careful manipulation of narrative. And as you're listening to this, as you're getting comfortable, as your brain is starting to wind down towards sleep, consider this. Institutions like this exist everywhere. Hospitals, schools, government buildings, corporations, the place where you work. They all have their secrets. Their sealed spaces. Their mysteries that have been carefully managed into obscurity. The only difference between this case and the ones around you is that this one happened to get documented. This one happened to have film footage. This one happened to have a detective obsessed enough to preserve the evidence. For every case that gets even this level of documentation, there are probably thousands that don't. Thousands of mysteries that get resolved not through investigation, but through institutional silence. Thousands of people who disappeared not into obvious tragedy, but into the mundane bureaucracy of institutional management. So tonight, as you settle in, as you're trying to sleep, maybe that's what you think about. Not the sealed wall, not the impossible timeline, not the 6 nurses, but the absolute ordinariness of how institutions hide things. The comfort of knowing that the world around you, the buildings you enter, the organizations you trust, they're all managing their own unsolved mysteries right now. And everybody's okay with it, because it's easier that way, because mystery is more restful than truth, because sometimes the best place to hide something is not behind a wall, but behind institutional indifference and public forgetting. Sleep well. The fan is still running. Everything is fine. Everything is just fine. Tonight, as you settle deeper into your bed, let your body do what bodies do when they're finally allowed to rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day settle into the mattress beneath you, where it belongs. Think about Margaret, Ruth, Dorothy, Helen, Susan, and Claire. 6 women who did a job that mattered. 6 women who showed up on a night when most people were sleeping. 6 women whose lives became unresolved, but whose humanity, their professionalism, their routines, their ordinary courage, those things remain documented. They existed. They mattered. And somewhere in institutional records, in sealed files and archived documents, that existence is preserved. Think about Detective Frank Morrison, a man who cared enough to be destroyed by caring. A man who sacrificed his career, his peace, his normal life, pursuing something he knew he couldn't solve. But he tried. He documented. He preserved the evidence. And in a world where institutions work very hard to make inconvenient truths disappear, Morrison's refusal to let go of what he knew, that itself was an act of resistance. Even though he lost, even though he was erased from the official narrative, he tried. Think about the night shift workers at St. Catherine's, and at hospitals like it, all over the world right now. They're there while you sleep. They're working in the quiet hours when everything feels smaller and stranger. They're taking care of people. They're maintaining systems. They're keeping watch over the vulnerable. And some of them, without knowing why, refuse to go certain places alone. Some of them sense that there are mysteries in the buildings where they work. But they show up anyway, night after night. That's extraordinary when you think about it. And think about yourself. You survived another day. You navigated institutions. You dealt with systems and bureaucracies and rules you didn't fully understand. You moved through a world that's far more complicated than it appears on the surface. You did that. You're doing that right now. You're alive in a time when information moves at the speed of light, and mysteries can still exist. Unresolved, unexplained, quietly managed into the background of acceptable reality. That takes strength. That takes a kind of resilience that we rarely acknowledge. The strength to live in a world where perfect resolution doesn't exist, where the truth is often hidden behind walls of institutional power, where some questions will never be answered, and to be okay with that, to accept it, to move forward anyway. So tonight, appreciate the safety of where you are. Appreciate the walls around you. Appreciate that you're not in a basement. You're not missing. You're not trapped in an unresolved mystery. You're here. You're safe. You're warm. And for tonight, that is enough. Tomorrow, the world will be complicated again. Mysteries will persist. Institutions will continue their quiet management of inconvenient truths. But tomorrow is not here yet. Right now, in this moment, you can rest. You can let go of the narrative. You can stop trying to solve things. Close your eyes. Let the fan keep running. Let the darkness be what it is, not frightening, but comfortable. A place where your brain can finally stop working, where your thoughts can dissolve, where the mysteries can wait. You did good. You survived another day. That's enough. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. And know that somewhere in sealed basements and archived documents in the careful silence of institutional memory, the truth is still waiting. But it can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, you rest.